Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. This is where you can find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today we are looking at the state of the Ukraine war 2.5 years in. Young Ukrainians who've grown up under the shadow of Russia's 2014 invasion of Crimea and then its all-out assault on Ukraine in 2022 have come of age in a country at war. How will that experience shape the future leaders of Ukraine? And more urgently, what is Ukrainian President Zelensky's plan to win the war, or at least not to lose it entirely? Or is it time for Ukraine to negotiate with Russia for a swift end to the fighting? We know Putin's plan: wait out the clock. And for now, it seems to be working. Here to talk about all that and more is Wall Street Journal correspondent and author Yaroslav Trofimov, who was born and raised in Kyiv and has covered the conflict extensively. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.
Yaroslav Trofimov, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be on the show.
So talk a little bit about life in Kyiv right now. We're well over 2 years into this war. What is it like on the ground?
Well, there is one direct effect, the war in Kyiv, that hasn't been really felt that much last year, for example, is lack of electricity. The Russian attacks on the Ukrainian power grid really eroded much of the capacity. And it shows, there are blackouts for several hours every day that affects the water services, that affects the refrigeration chain in shops and restaurants. And the other effect is that the Russian missile attacks on Kyiv have been more successful this year than last year, in part because Ukraine has a shortage of interceptors, the Patriot missiles and other interceptors for the air defenses. And in part because the Russians have become more technically astute and they have improved the way their cruise missiles and ballistic missiles work, because they've been learning the lessons, technological lessons of the war as well. And so we've had this horrendous attack on the children's hospital in Kyiv recently, a hospital where I was born. That really sort of brought war home to Kyiv, which for a large part of this conflict, outside the initial weeks of when the Russians were at the gates of Kyiv, kind of felt insulated and safe-ish, if you will.
Interesting, because of course, we're seeing so many Russian, missiles all across the country. Even to Lviv, which is like right on the Poland border in the west. And you're saying that Kyiv itself, until recently, it felt like it was sort of a protected capital.
Right, because it depends on how you allocate your batteries and how you allocate your defense.
The batteries, the anti-aircraft.
The
batteries, the Patriot missile system.
Well, Patriots, not just Patriots, there were the Iris-Ts, there were the French SAMPT. So there's a whole area of different types of anti-missile assets. And Kyiv was in this bubble because, this is where the government is, this is where the most strategic installations are, and the interception rates in Kyiv were exceptionally high. Even the Russian hypersonic ballistic missiles, the Kinzhals, that the Russians had claimed would not be shot down, were actually shot down over Kyiv. But the fact is that these interceptor missiles are very, very expensive, and Ukraine is just simply running out of them, especially as a result of this month-long freeze in the funding that only ended a few months ago.
And also the attacks by the Russians on the critical infrastructure for energy, that has stepped up significantly in the past months. Now it's, right, the weather's nice now, but come wintertime, one expects that's going to be a very serious problem for
Right, so there were two waves. There was the first wave that the Russians launched in about October 2022, that went through that winter, when they really, really tried to knock down the entire grid, and they failed. The Ukrainian grid held. The Ukrainians managed to repair some of it, and then the Russian attacks on electricity infrastructure stopped for more than a year. Then they resumed again in January 2024, and they learned the lessons. So they were much more methodical in how they go after it, And the situation is already bad because it's hot, so people cannot use air conditioners. And it's going to get much worse in the winter for sure.
Now, one way that I would think the Ukrainians would feel this much more directly is just how many young Ukrainian men have been sent to the front line. And they're still there, right? And I mean, like, there's no end to the deployment. In fact, they've extended that, right, at this point. They brought the age down from 28 to 26, 25 to 25 now. And I mean, no matter where you are, you're feeling that absence. How does that affect morale for the Ukrainian people? How does it affect their views of the future of this war?
Well, it's not just the young people. The Ukraine, like Russia, has a shortage of young people. For every 25-year-old, there are 2 40, 50-year-olds. And people of all ages are absent because people of all ages have been sent to the front line by the hundreds of thousands.
Men.
Men, yes, men. And some women as well. I mean, there are women soldiers, but it's the men who are drafted and sent. It's not very popular. That's clear. It's not also very popular how the selection is being made because there used to be, and there probably is, a lot of corruption in the draft process. People who are wealthier could pay the way out of the draft. And but then
that's still happening.
That is
now,
still happening,
even 2 years in. Yeah.
I mean, it's maybe not at the same scale as it was in the beginning because there was a lot of efforts to all the regional recruitment heads were fired by Zelensky. Some were put in jail after enormous assets were found in their possession. But all in all, it's human nature. So I'm sure not everything is 100% clean, as in any war. But again, it isn't popular. However, what is the alternative? The alternative is surrender, and surrender is also not popular. And I think Ukrainians really know what happens when the country disappears and when they are at Moscow's mercy. Ukraine was one of the deadliest places on earth back in the 30s and the 40s. There was an artificial famine that Stalin had orchestrated in Ukraine, killing millions. There was cannibalism, there was horrible, horrible things happening. Then there were the war and the Holocaust. And so that historical memory, this trauma is, it's in the family history of everyone. In my family's history, I wrote a novel about it.
In your novel, Yaroslav, No Country for Love, you talked a lot about the extraordinary, frankly, the savage and tragic history that the Ukrainians felt at the hands of the Russians in the period of the Soviet Union. Talk a little bit about the implications of that for how Ukrainians think today.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, the novel is based on my own family's history in the 1930s and 1940s, at the time where Ukraine really was the deadliest place on earth. Millions died in the artificial famine that Stalin had engineered. The cream of Ukraine's intellectual class was destroyed in the labor camps and executed. Then came the war, the destruction of Kyiv and other cities, the Holocaust, and then there was an insurgency after the war that also killed untold numbers of people in the Ukrainian countryside. An insurgency that only ended in the 1950s. And that historical memory is carried by everyone in Ukraine. So everyone like me, has grandparents, great-grandparents, that are the survivors of this myth grandeur of history. That is one of the most horrendous episodes of 20th century history. And in the back of their minds, people know that the alternative to fighting for independent Ukraine, the alternative to continuing to sustain the losses on the battlefield is surrender. And surrender to Russia would mean the return of all those horrors, would mean the return of all this historical memory. And the Russians not hiding their intentions. And so the rehabilitation of the Stalinist time, the worship of the atrocities, the closing of all the museums, and the destruction of the monuments to the victims of Stalinism they're seeing in Russia right now, and in occupied parts of Ukraine, are a reminder that this is the blueprint that many in Russia want to return to.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand that for the Ukrainians, there is a never again component of this that, has been made very aware to Americans on the Israel front after October 7th. In many ways, resonates every bit as deeply for the Ukrainian people.
Well, absolutely. And what's compounding this never again component is that there's a denialism. I mean, Russia denies the existence of the famine in Ukraine. It denies
when literally millions of Ukrainians were
millions.
killed.
There was widespread cannibalism. Like the Ukrainian countryside was ravaged and depopulated, And yet, the first things the Russian occupation troops do when they enter Ukrainian towns, they destroy the monuments to the victims of the famine, because the state never existed.
Is it the view of the Ukrainian people that the Russians want to wipe them out as a nation? Because again, I mean, we see some of that rhetoric in the United States as well. But of course, I mean, the reality is that the front lines have been very stable for a long time. So I think a lot of non-Ukrainians watching this show wouldn't necessarily accept, at least not immediately, that the alternative to just fighting is surrendering your whole country. Why wouldn't the alternative to fighting be, even if you don't trust the Russians, make sure you get weapons, support, and defense, and just like hold on to the front lines, but try to end the fighting? Again, you see this, so I'm wondering how you, because you clearly come from it, it's very personal for you. I want you to explain to people.
Yeah, I think it's not the issue of what Ukrainians believe, it's the issue of what the Russians say. The Russian former president, Dmitry Medvedev, who is the head of the ruling party in Russia. And
Former prime minister, that's right.
Former president.
Former president, actually, not in principle at least, yeah. He had the position, he wasn't running the country, but yes.
Right. So he's, he says what the Russian establishment really thinks and not necessarily says. So he's on the record every day. He just put out a statement saying that, even if Ukraine signs, the peace agreement and gives us all the lands we want, it will just be a first step towards annihilating Ukraine, because no Ukrainian state will ever be acceptable, no matter how friendly to Russia. And the whole idea of Ukrainian is poison, and they all have to become Russians. Vladimir Putin, in his interview with Tucker Carlson, spent half an hour explaining why the Ukrainian nation is artificial, and Ukraine is Russia, and how the Ukrainian language was really invented by the Austro-Hungarian general staff in World War I to undermine Russia. So the discourse in Russia is very clear. The Ukraine should not exist as a country. Ukrainians should not exist as a nation. They should become re-educated in Russian. And the nationalist elite must be physically annihilated, the way Ukrainian writers and poets and painters were all shot in the 1930s. So the blueprint is there. And it's not a question of Ukrainians thinking what the fate will be under Russian rule. The Russians are very clear about their goals. And yes, the front line has been reasonably stable at a huge cost to lives, especially at a time where American weapons were not coming through. But it doesn't mean it will be stable forever. I mean, the reason it is stable is because Ukrainians are going to the front line and dying.
So I guess, given what you're saying, right, which is that the alternative is annihilation, right, and we've seen it historically, then why don't we have 99% of Ukrainians supporting the war? Because it's not, right? I mean, it was over 90 at the beginning, but now those numbers are going down, right? I mean, significantly down. You have a lot of Ukrainians in recent Ukrainian polls saying, we need to negotiate. We need to find a way to, well, have they forgotten their history? What is it?
Well, I think we fixate on territory, and I think the issue is not just territory. I mean, it's a very different proposition to say, as Russia wants, let's settle on the current borders plus minus areas that Russia currently demands, so the cities of Zaporizhia and Kherson.
In the southeast, yeah.
In the southeast, which is a big area that they still want. Because the Russian precondition is we will sit down and talk with Ukraine.
This is the area that they annexed illegally, but do not occupy.
Exactly.
At this point. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
So these are the areas that the Russian government proclaimed to be part of Russia,
right,
without actually physically controlling them. So
which is an odd thing to do at the end of the day.
It's a big area. It's an area about the size of Taiwan.
Right.
It's not a small area. And it contains two very big cities. Right. However, even if you do that and say, okay, we accept the partition along these lines, the next Russian demand is, and the rest of Ukraine must be neutral, which means neutered, which means it should not be allowed to receive any weapons from the West, any security guarantees, and would basically that such a deal would just lay the ground for the next phase, where Russia takes over the rest of Ukraine. If, on the other hand, the partition deal, a temporary partition deal, presupposes that the rest of Ukraine will be, protected by security guarantees from the U.S. and NATO, and will be armed to its teeth to resist Russia should it try to attack the rest of it, that's a very different deal. Mm-hmm. But no one right now at this stage is proposing that. No one in the West.
Well, the Europeans are certainly proposing that under any circumstances, there should be long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, that they should continue to have weapons and training and intelligence and the capacity to defend themselves. I mean, those commitments that you're hearing from the Europeans and from NATO leadership, and the US is a special case for reasons we can get into, have not just been about today. They've been long-term commitments. The West, I think, is saying that.
Well, none of this is really operational unless it is a formal treaty commitment. People can say all sorts of things. Ukraine was promised security guarantees, was security assurances, as they were called, in the 90s when it gave up its nuclear weapons.
The so-called Budapest Memorandum.
Exactly. Right. And,
the Americans, the UK, the Russians were all signatories.
Absolutely,
Turned
yes.
out didn't mean very much.
Well, it meant nothing.
Yeah.
And so, nothing short of a formal treaty commitment, such as the Article 5 commitment in NATO, would really deter Russia. And everybody understands that. And so, yes, Ukraine is signaling now that it's ready to talk. President Zelensky excluded Russia from the first peace conference in Switzerland, and he's now saying we would accept Russia to be in the next round. The question is, how do you frame it, and whether this ceasefire along current lines or something like that would lead to Ukraine being integrated into the Western structures and being sheltered, or will we just, a pause that allows Russia to go and bite off another bit of Ukraine, as happened after the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 15. And, if you look at the Ukrainian mood, you're right. I mean, Ukrainians are, the society is under stress. So it's hard. Everybody knows people who were killed or maimed. Everybody lives in conditions of hardship. And there was an opinion poll recently that kind of encapsulated these things. So there was one question that was asked, how do you want the war to end? And the vast majority, about 90%, said we want a return of either all the territories that we had in 2022 or all the territories within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders of 1991, including Crimea and Donbass. But there was another question, which asked, do you think it's morally shameful to be a draft dodger? And only 29% said yes.
Which is a collective action problem there.
Well, yeah. Well, because people have this political aspirations, but they know how dangerous it is to.
They know what it means as an individual human being.
Exactly, and so not a lot of people, considering the high odds of being killed or maimed if you end up in the front line, a lot of people don't want to do that, and you do have this phenomenon of Ukrainian men trying to escape. Several dozen drowned in the Tisa River on the Romanian border as they were trying to swim across.
And this isn't like Vietnam, right? I mean, like, everybody understands that this is a just war that the Ukrainians are fighting. And yet a strong majority of Ukrainians say it's okay to dodge the draft.
Well, again, at some point, the question of individual survival, has to balance against the question of collective survival. And, it's human nature for many people.
Look, I think it's a good thing for people around the world to understand that the Ukrainians are humans. They're not superhumans. Yeah. They're not like some other breed that is somehow more courageous than everyone else. They're people. And they deserve rights and principles and safety, but they also deserve kind of our empathy when they can't be super people.
Right. Yeah. And it's, and again, this is the numbers now, when, as you said, the front line is relatively stable and there are no Russian tanks at the gates of Kyiv. If the front line were to be broken and if the Russians were to be advancing in Kyiv, a lot of people who are not willing to go and fight now would come out and fight again, as we saw in the very beginning of the war, where everyone came out. I remember driving through Kyiv on day 2 of the war, right after Zelensky came out and made his speech outside the presidential palace saying, we are all here. We're not going anywhere. And there were thousands and thousands of young men and women just thronging to pick up weapons and go to the front line. And the front line was very close. It was on the outskirts of Kyiv. And because you had this collective surge of indignation and how dare they come and try to take our city. And so this thing's sort of ebb and flow. Now is a difficult period, not the most difficult, because the Russians have not been able to achieve their goals this year. And despite this big offensive in the north, trying to take Kharkiv, they caught the Ukrainians by surprise, but were stopped after a few days, and now it's really turning against them up there.
With a lot of Russian casualties as well.
With a lot of Russian casualties, and it's the Ukrainians who are now slowly pushing them back towards the border. So they lost the momentum up there. And so, the Russia is also not a giant military power that people feared, and it has not been able to break through.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.
Now, I wanted to ask you, it's interesting. Of course, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of mistrust of what might happen if Trump becomes president of the United States. It was an assassination attempt against the former president, and President Zelensky of Ukraine reached out and called Trump. Trump took the call, and the readout of the call, in addition to Zelensky saying the right things about "so sorry" and "glad you're okay" and everything else, was that they talked about a just and lasting peace, and they were both aligned. Now, anyone watching the media over the last year would have been startled by that readout from Zelensky. Explain.
Well, I think, first of all, Zelensky has been trying to reach out to former President Trump for a long time. And people like Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of the UK, has been doing a bit of shuttle diplomacy on this, as was Senator Lindsey Graham. And honestly, the passage of the supplemental would have been impossible if President Trump had
opposed it.
Exactly.
This was $61 billion from the U.S. to Ukraine, and Trump basically said, if the GOP wants to vote for it, that's okay.
Well, he said more than that. He said, he put out a statement on Truth Social that said his usual rhetoric that, it's a European problem, Europeans should be in the lead. He said, the security and the strength of Ukraine are more important to Europeans, but they're also important to us. And this is also important to us, really was the green light that allowed the House to pass the legislation just days later. So you had this, more nuanced position from former President Trump. And the Ukrainians are hoping that perhaps he would continue the aid. Because again, what he has said is, I will come up with a peace plan. And if the Russians don't like it, we will double down on our aid for Ukraine. And it's unlikely that he will propose anything that the Russians would actually accept, because the Russian aspirations go much further than freezing the conflict lines
at his present territory.
At the present territory. So we'll see. Obviously, other voices in the party, like J.D. Vance, have been much more negative on Ukraine, but we don't yet know if President Trump wins re-election, obviously.
It clearly would be interesting,
yeah,
right? To have an American president being willing to smoke the Russians out on that. Because, the fact is that the U.S. hasn't been leaning on Ukraine to say, okay, we need to start negotiating. We need to see where Putin's red lines are, or else. And clearly that has been Trump's line, because he wants to say he's the guy that ends the war. And if he ends the war, or is prepared to end the war in a way that is seen, okay, not by the Ukrainians and the Russians, but by everybody else as a reasonable outcome, that would be something that the Russians would have to at least think twice about.
Well, I don't know if the Europeans will see a war that ends with the Russians in control of 20% of Ukraine as a reasonable outcome necessarily. The contrast with it...
The Poles won't, the Balts won't, the Nordics won't,
the
Germans will.
It depends.
Again, it depends on what kind of guarantees the Ukrainians get, right?
Yeah, exactly. It depends on whether this is interpreted by the Russians as a reprieve that allows them to keep going, or it comes together with much greater commitment to Ukraine in the future, and bringing Ukraine to the fold of NATO. It's not without precedent. When West Germany joined NATO, it also had disputed borders. So there is a precedent for that if there is a will. And so that's a big if. I think Trump's biggest asset is his unpredictability. The madman theory, from Nixon on, it does work in international relations. And that's what the Baltic states and the Poles were always complaining about with the Biden administration, is that it telegraphed its intentions in precise detail to the Russians, and
Which didn't stop them.
And allowed them to game the system. And the Russians, as I argue in this book about the first year of the war in Ukraine, our enemies will vanish. They have really gamed those fears, and they successfully used the nuclear blackmail to throttle American aid to Ukraine at the critical junctions. And finally, when all these self-imposed red lines were crossed, it was just too late. All this equipment that came to Ukraine in the second and third year of the war, would have turned the tide in the first year. But by the time it arrived, the Russians had mobilized hundreds and thousands of men, rebuilt the military industries, and changed their tactics, and it was not nearly as efficient as it could have been.
Yeah, in many ways, the West deterred itself.
Absolutely. Self-deterrence was the name of the game here, and we're really paying a very expensive price for this in Ukraine and in the West, in terms of lives, in terms of money, in terms of ammunition that's been expended, because more aid in the beginning would have meant a much shorter war.
Yaroslav Trofimov, thanks for joining us.
Great to be on the show.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Do you like what you heard? Of course you do. Why not make it official? Why don't you rate and review GZERO World? 5 stars, only 5 stars, otherwise don't do it. On Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com. And from our friends at Foreign Policy, each week on Foreign Policy Live, Editor-in-Chief Ravi Agrawal sits down with world leaders and policy experts to discuss the issues that matter most, from the U.S.-China relationship and the Israel-Hamas war to the Global South's growing clout. Listen and follow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.